maybe the most famous and the most significant criminal of the 90s. Yeltsin in 93 bombed the parliament, a freely elected parliament, which for me, and of course I remember that episode because I was in Russia at the time, he switched from being purely criminal, a predatory kind of organized crime, to become a kind of organized crime that actually does something for somebody. But in the case of Russia, they are freelancers, so they operate independently of the state. But when the state needs you, you have to operate and do what they ask.
Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw. In today's episode, I speak to Federico Varese, a very prominent criminologist who has worked on mafia structures and mafia-like activities almost his entire career. He's written a very important short book called Russia in Four Criminals. What's important about the book, apart from the fact that it also traces Varese's own career, is that it covers four individuals who represent four epochs in the evolution of the Russian criminal economy. The first is a classic mafioso. The second is an oligarch. The third is a drug dealer who exposed abuse within the Russian prison system. And the fourth is a cyber criminal with links to the state. It shows just how the criminal economy in Russia has evolved. And importantly, in each case, it maps out the connections to the Russian state. Federico, welcome to the discussion. It's really a great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Federico, just before we get into the book, you're a sort of doyen in the area of the study of organized crime, and you have some very prominent books, some important articles. Won't you just provide an outline of your career? How did you get into this? Was that by accident? And clearly your academic and scholarly career developed from your early work, and you've kept on focusing in the area.
Yes, so I was a graduate in political science and a student ultimately in the 80s. And what was happening in the 80s was something extraordinary, something that I really wanted to study and to dwell into, which was the end of the Soviet Union, or at least at the beginning, the transformation of the Soviet Union, and then eventually the demise of the Soviet Union. So it was the end of a political, economic, and social system, which I was fascinated by. And so I really wanted to study that transition or that transformation. And I thought that was my only chance in life to see such a massive transformation that involved and touched upon an entire continent. So I decided that that's what I wanted to study from my undergraduate years at the University of Bologna. And then I went on to the University of Cambridge to do an MPhil, so-called. So it's like a master's program in social and political theory and social and political sciences. And so I wanted to study the Soviet Union, the transition to the market economy, and ideally to democracy. At Cambridge, I met a supervisor, a professor there, who was my mentor. And he had just been working on a book on the Sicilian Mafia, which came out in 93, called The Sicilian Mafia, in fact, by Diego Gambe.
A very famous book, Federico.
Yes, exactly. Great book. I had the opportunity to read it in advance, and I was duly cited and thanked for my readings and comments. And so it crossed my mind, with the help of my supervisor, that something similar might be happening in Russia as a consequence of the transition to the market economy. So as the transition was happening, there was also in Russia, like there had been in Sicily, a state that was incapable or ineffective in managing the transition and managing the new market economy. So I come from a sort of political science and sociology background, and for us it's very clear that markets do not exist in nature. Markets are a product of the state ultimately and regulations. And so if the state is ineffective and incapable to regulate the new market economy and the new transactions, then who is going to do that? I mean, you can live in an ideal paradise where people just get along, or you might live in a situation where other people come into the picture and try to manage and control or interfere, enter market relations. And so that was why I was fascinated by that process, and it got me started on a project that started around the beginning of the 90s, in 91, I think, roughly, which took the good, good 10 years, in fact, possibly a little more, which was my sort of DPhil dissertation at the University of Oxford, which then became a book called The Russian Mafia. So in short, that was motivated my passion for the topic. So it was a strange roundabout way to get into organized crime, which of course is a topic which is very hot in my country of origin, namely Italy.
Federico, it's a slightly different book from your previous ones, which I've read. It's shorter and it's punchier. What was the idea behind it? Were you reaching for a broader audience? This is quite a policy book. It's very manageable. You can read it almost in one sitting. What was the idea behind it?
Yes, I wanted to experiment with a different format. So the book is based on research I did in the 90s and also later on, and is also partly based on pieces I've written here and there. But yes, the model is very different from my previous books. And the idea is that each decade of the post-Soviet period in Russia can be summarized, or at least or we can identify with a particular character. So I think the essence of storytelling is to focus on a person, on a story, on somebody's life. And so I thought I would want to pick a person who is representative of that decade, and of course representative of the criminal dimension or the criminal world or the prison system of that decade, and around the person weave a story that tells us something profound and deep and hopefully correct about that particular decade in the Russian transition. And so that's why I use that model of writing, and I'm glad you liked it.
I liked it a lot. I have to be honest. It's structured well and it's a great read. Federico, talk us through these four gentlemen, one at a time. What did they represent? Who were they? What happened to them?
Yeah, so we should start with Ivankov, who is the sort of maybe the most famous and the most significant criminal of the 90s. Ivankov was somebody I came across a lot when I was doing my field work. He was a member of the fraternity of the Vori v Zakonie, the so-called thieves in law, or how I translate it is, I think, better as criminals with a code of honor. But really what he did and what he innovated in is to give a new dimension to gangs and gangsterism in Russia in the 80s and early 90s. He had joined the gang. It was basically a gang of robbers, ultimately. But he understood something that others had not understood, that it was better actually not to just rob somebody, but to settle disputes. So when somebody got robbed, for instance, a jeweler got robbed of some of the jewelry that he had acquired illegally or unlawfully, the gang would actually go and settle the dispute on behalf of this person. So he switched from being purely criminal, a predatory kind of organized crime, to become a kind of organized crime that actually does something for somebody. And of course, in the underworld, there is no state, right? You cannot, if you steal jewelry, you cannot go to the state and say, oh, somebody is going to steal my stolen jewelry. And really what Ivankov did is what really is the essence of mafias around the world, which is namely to govern the underworld and to govern illegal transactions when there is absence of trust and in a context in which the state, of course, is not going to help you to govern that particular sphere of the world. And so he also became very prominent. He went to the United States, where he lived in Brighton Beach for a while. He was eventually a very high-profile arrest in the US, and he was sent back to Russia, where he was supposed to go to prison, but of course he didn't. And then he continued to do this work in the next decade, until eventually, as I hope I'm not going to spoil anything, but people in the world I study tend to be killed. So he was killed as he was walking out of a restaurant in the early 2000s. So for me, he epitomizes this transition from being purely thieving to being protective and to do something for somebody at least. And he had joined, of course, this fraternity of the Vori v Zakonie, and which is something I've been studying a lot since I was a student for my PhD. And he was a prominent member of that. So that action or phase allowed me to also to describe the fraternity, what it was, how it emerged, the rules, the norms of behavior, the language, and I hope that that works.
The next character in the story is an oligarch. Tell us something about him. Widely known figure, and you write about him in a very compelling way.
Yes, the next figure is Boris Berezovsky. He was a scholar, a quite entrepreneurial type of scholar in the Soviet Union. He was the head of a research team in a research institute. In fact, he was studying game theory and decision theory, which is a topic, of course, very big in the West, especially in economics. But in the Soviet Union, it wasn't such a high-profile topic. Also, given the nature of the political system and the economic system. He was certainly a very smart man, and he understood something at the beginning of the transformation of the Soviet regime into the post-Soviet regime, that there were money to be made. There were money to be made, and he joined up his research institute with the producer of the biggest producer of cars in the Soviet Union and then Russia. And basically, he became an entrepreneur. He saw the future and wanted to grab it. And he, of course, was coming from a quite relatively, well, he was an intellectual family, of course, his family, that also had been slightly discriminated because of their religious background. And so he just wanted to make money, and he did. And he became a man who made a lot of money, not in the way that you would like to see money to be made. So he wasn't producing anything, he was arbitraging between the prices that were still controlled in the Soviet system or the post-Soviet system and the outside prices and the international prices for the cars. Also at a time of very high inflation. So he was basically a crook. I mean, he wasn't exactly a producer of anything. And he became a very good friend and became a helper and supporter of Boris Yeltsin through ways that I describe in the book, which I might not, maybe I skip some of them. And he became a close confidant and very, very central to their political system. So I think what I wanted to do with him was to say, well, in Russia there is more than just the mafia, the Voris Zakoni that I study, and that are, of course, very important in the criminal underworld. There is also kind of a state crime or a attitude to money that was coming from the top that had a lot to do with thieving and taking away the resources of the Russian people at that point. Also, I think that character allows me to explore the beginning of a transformation of the political system from a democracy, which I think it was between at least 1991 and 1993, to a more authoritarian regime led by Yeltsin. So I also wanted to say something about the future trajectory of Russia in the post-Yeltsin period. Yeltsin, something I discuss in the book a lot. Yeltsin in 93 bombed the parliament, a freely elected parliament, which for me, and of course I remember that episode because I was in Russia at the time, and I also was in Russia when there was a coup d'etat against Gorbachev. So I remember that very well because we obviously to bomb a parliament is a big deal if you want to be a democracy. And the West, of course, in that particular case, did not object to it. In fact, I report in the book that there was a phone call from the President of the United States who supported the actions of Yeltsin. So for me, that was the beginning of a authoritarian trajectory that, of course, we have seen after Yeltsin.
Federica, you were in Russia at the time working on your doctoral thesis, were you? So, in a way, this book, at least something I drew from it, it spans your career. There are bits and pieces, and you recount your own experience at different points in Soviet and Russian history. I mean, is that a good reading of it? It's a short book, but it's sort of an overarching umbrella of much of what you've been doing.
Yes, I try to put myself into the story. So thank you for making that point. That was what I was trying to do, not just to tell a story about other people, but also to tell my story. And in a sense, I tell stories that I never told before. And now, after 20 years, it's possible to tell them, while at the time it was slightly dangerous or unwise to do, because, of course, another aspect of our work is to be careful. And so, yes, it allowed me to expand on that as well. I mean, obviously not exaggerating, because obviously the interesting story is not me, but I think I wanted to, yeah, to give also the point of view of a young student going to a student hostel in Russia in the 90s and observing the young entrepreneurial generation that was trying to make it in the new market economy, hitting against the fact that there was no protection from the state, and hence they were victims of organized crime, and some, of course, were not victims and were collaborating with organized crime, but a lot of them were the victims.
The mafia boss is your first character. You then talk about the oligarch. Your third character is someone you label the convict. Who's that?
So he is actually a completely different kind of person. He was probably framed and entered prison in a way that is really, really different from other characters in my story. So he's truly a victim of the system. And the reason why I chose him is that he experienced and witnessed the transformation I was exactly talking about a second ago, namely the increasing authoritarianism of Russia. The increasing authoritarianism of Russia applies not only to civil society and to dissidents, of course, but also to the criminal underworld. And so he allowed me to explore the condition of life in the prison system in Russia, and he himself was a witness to this, to the point that it is something extraordinary for which we are all very grateful to him. That's why it's a very different character from the others, namely to take out of his prison a number of videos that testify to the torture to which inmates are subjected to, both the criminals I study, including the Vori, but also obviously the non-criminal element within the prison system. So he had this extraordinary access, because he was eventually put to work in an office, and in this office he had access to the body cams of the prison guards. And at first this body cams footage was quite innocuous, but then he actually saw that it depicted a very severe torture against inmates. Now, the Vori that I study have a series of rules of behavior within the prison system, and how a Vor, i.e. a boss of the Russian mafia, should behave in prison. And one, of course, is never to engage in homosexual activities in a passive way. And of course, what the prison guards were doing was to exploit these rules in order to create problems for the criminals that I study. And also I document how the rules then were adapted, and precisely because the fraternity of the criminals that I study recognized that these rules were used against them in order to weaken the organization. So for me, that story is really the story of Russia under Putin, and the chapter, of course, expands on that as well. The story of Russia under Putin, the repression of dissidents, the repression of civil society, the abrogation or the changing in the law regarding free expression, and so on and so forth. So it is, in a sense, the chapter of Putin 1 and 2, the first Putin, and then the increasingly more authoritarian and conservative Putin from 2012.
The convict is Sergei Savalev, right? Material on him was also widely available. You were not struggling for sources. This was in the press. Or was there additional material that you had acquired at the time or later?
Well, in this case, I was able to interview him, and so I interviewed him, and of course I interviewed also the NGO that released these videos that worked for. So it was a very sort of elaborate system that he used to take these videos out. When he was released, of course, then he had to escape Russia. Actually, he's from Belarus, and so I describe how he was helped by an NGO which did this great work and put it up online. And so I had interviewed him for an Italian newspaper very soon after the news came out, of his activities. And then I think subsequently there have been documentaries. There was a BBC documentary about the story as well. So it's a quite well documented story. And he's not the only one, of course, who documented this torture, but in a sense, he's the one who had the biggest impact. His videos were actually mentioned by Putin at one of the end of the year conferences. There was a question about it that he answered.
The fourth character, so to speak, in the book is you call him the cyber criminal. He's more of a modern incarnation of the series of developing individuals.
Yes, another feature of Russia, which is semi-fascinating but also worrying, is that it's probably the biggest hub of cybercrime in the world. So the deal between the authorities and the cybercriminal world is that the authorities are not going really after them as long as these cybercriminals do not attack Russian targets or Russian citizens. And apparently there is a story, I don't know how true it is, but a story that if one of these Russian cybercriminals can spot that you have a Cyrillic keyboard on your computer, you'll be left alone. So this person in particular, of course, he's extremely smart and invented a virus, or what I would call a virus. It's a malware that has a particular feature, and it's probably the most important malware out there today, called Gozi. And what happens is that this Gozi usually arrives to you in your inbox through an email, usually attached to a file, say a PDF file, which looks perfectly fine. And if you do the mistake to click on that PDF, the virus is activated and it takes over your computer, and you don't know it. And this virus, as I describe in the book, has been undetected for a long time by the best antivirus systems. And so for a number of years, the virus was the most widespread viruses in this world. And so it takes over your computer and then, of course, enters the computer, finds all the password, your banking online system, and empties your account. And you don't even know, because it still looks like it's in the black, but actually you have been robbed. Now, he also had another invention, which, if anything, is as important or even more important. So he thought of cybercrime not anymore as an activity that you do individually. So the way we think about a cybercriminal is that the guy, usually a man, sits in his sort of bedroom and sends a virus to our computer. But he invented a system called the Cybercrime as a Service, in which most of the infrastructure and the help that you need to launch a DDoS attack or a malware to take money out of credit card numbers is protected and in a sense governed by this system. So you pay a fee, as much as you pay a fee to Microsoft to service your Word files. You pay a fee to the system, which could be $2,000 more or less, and if you have any problem, they would help you, and they give you basically a ready to use a malware that you can just push a button and send. Then, of course, cybercrime is not just about the malware. Of course, the cybercrime is about what do you do, where do you store it. So you need a space on the internet to store, like a server, secret server where you can store your malware kit. You also need eventually to cache out what you have stolen. And so he invented a system that would allow you to do all of this through this group. And that's an extremely significant development. And then eventually he sold this business and thought he would stop being involved in any kind of cybercrime, and he moved on with his life. But he was under the radar of the US authorities, so he was arrested in the United States when he traveled there and served time. Was eventually released, and now is doing something completely different. He's a free man. So for me, what this story tells you is that while we think of Russia as a super authoritarian, super controlled society, there are areas of that which really escape the control of the state, partly because the state cannot do it, because they don't really have the capacities to do it, partly because they need these cyber criminals for their political attacks. So in the chapter, I describe how the Secret Service would use cybercrime on a freelance base to attack targets in the West. And this is very different from the Chinese model, which has internalized the cybercrime attacks within the army. So if you look at the top 10 cyber criminals most wanted by the FBI, you will see there are a couple of colonels and majors on the Chinese army, People's Liberation Army. But in the case of Russia, they are freelancers, so they operate independently of the state. But when the state needs you, you have to operate and do what they ask you. So they to hack a particular email account or attack a particular site, such as NATO, or in the case of the UK, they attacked also hospitals.
Federico, this fourth chapter is fascinating. It brings me to the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war. Has that changed the nature of the cybercrime economy? Are there criminal or state criminal affiliated people on both sides now involved in the war? Essentially, how has it transformed the cyber economy, the cybercrime economy?
Yes. So in a sense, the war that started against Ukraine in 2014 and is continuing today has had an effect on organized crime in general, and in particular on cybercrime. The most immediate effect is that before the confrontation, military confrontation between Ukraine and Russia, the cybercrime ecosystem was unified. It was a Russian-speaking unified ecosystem, which included Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians. With the war, that ecosystem has split up, and the Ukrainian cyber criminals have now joined forces with the state in the fight for their resistance. So there was a story, for instance, of a group based in St. Petersburg that had Ukrainians in it, and the group came out in favor of the war. The group was called Conti, actually, and as they came out in favor of the war, somebody within the group was clearly not in favor of the war and leaked to the internet all the conversation of the group for over 2 years, in which we obviously find out quite a lot about the interaction between the state and the group. And so clearly the war has created a tension within this ecosystem and certainly split the sort of Russian-speaking system into Ukrainians versus Belarusians and Russians.
Interesting, Federico, because another book that we will have on this series is about Conti itself, and so we'll have an interview with Max Schmitz, the author of that book, also in the series. And it's a fascinating story: the fragmentation, the leaking of the information, the availability of that information for researchers. Federico, you have this fascinating line. Okay, coming back to this idea of your career, and this book as a sort of overarching story about your subject matter, but also about yourself. And you mention in conclusion this article that you wrote in 1994 when you were a student, and the title, I think, is Sicily the Future of Russia? Has that article now got a sort of second reading, a second point of reference and relevance in your view?
To answer your question is yes. I think the article is still relevant. There is a second coming. The article is really trying to see whether Russia could become a hotbed for the mafia. So the story was that there was a transition to the market economy in the 80s, the inability of the state to define and protect property rights. At the same time, the presence of people who had been fighting in wars, such as the Afghan war, who were coming back with skills that were skills to military skills, so that you could use in the underworld, and also people who were coming out of prison, because a consequence of the transition was that some people left prison in a less oppressive system, of course, in the post-Soviet Russia than in Russia. So you had this combination of a demand for governance and protection of the legal economy, and a presence of a supply of people trained in the use of violence that were now unemployed because they had left prison or they were coming back from Afghanistan. And the article really tries to make the point that this is very much what happened in Sicily in the 19th century.
where your supervisor had written this book.
Absolutely. So I was taking his argument and his model and tried to apply it to Russia. And just in a nutshell, Sicily had the same experience. It was a very late and very rapid transition to the market economy between a few years, between 1806 and 1812. Land was privatized. It went from 6,000 to 60,000 hectares in private land, in private hands. And the state was not able to protect. And there was an economic boom as well. So Sicily was at the center of international trade. Lemons were exported. And so the people who were producers in the countryside started to rely on these groups that would help escort the products from the interior to the markets in the exterior, namely Palermo. So that was the argument of the article. Now, coming to your question, is it still relevant today? Is it still relevant today? And I think it is. It is because what you saw in the 80s and 90s, especially the 80s in Russia, was, for instance, the birth of gangs within the currency exchange world. So it might seem like a small thing, but a lot of the gangs that became prominent in the 90s had started in the underworld, exchanging currency for tourists and people who needed currency. And now in Russia today, we are observing the same thing because there is now a lot of restrictions on availability and possession of foreign currency. So there are a lot of telegrams channels where you see a lot of people offering foreign currency and also wanting to buy it. But then we are back to the same problem. It's an illegal exchange, it's an illegal market, and who is going to do the protection of that market? Second similarity, we are now seeing a huge increase in violent crimes in Russia because people coming back from the war, some of them are themselves hard criminals from the prison, but some are just victims of the war who come back and commit very violent crimes. So we see a spike in violent crime. We also see a reduction in attention to issues of corruption and malfeasance. And so this is a group of people trained in the use of violence who could become the seed of a potential groups that might become active. Also, we see the fact that there is sanctions busting in the Soviet Union, of course, in the current Russia, because the government really needs to have goods that have to come through the illegal market. So you have a massive illegal market. You have a fleet of ships also that is moving illegally around the world to get these goods that are prohibited and cannot be sold to Russia. So you have a number of elements that give the suggestion, at least, that not all things are going well for the Russian society, that there is an increasing crime, an increasing people trained in the use of violence, and also an authoritarian state that cannot really control a lot of what is going on in the real economy.
Fascinating, Federico. You mention in the book this concept of political protection as it relates to Russia through the four characters. Can you just give your thoughts on political protection more generally, globally, in your reading, outside of Russia, in Western Europe, in North America, in Africa, elsewhere, how you think it's evolving in this sort of wider global ecosystem of illicit markets and organized crime?
Yes, I suppose there are two concepts here. One is criminal protection, which is the one I really study, and then also the political protection, which is the difference is that criminal protection is provided by groups which are independent of the state, such as the mafia or criminal groups. And then there is, of course, the political protection, which is really the topic of chapter 2, the Berezovsky chapter that we discussed earlier. So to start with criminal protection, I think it's of course very hard to generalize as global trends, but certainly if you look at Latin America, there is an increasingly vast presence of gangs or so-called cartels or combos, whatever you want to call them, that operate in parts of Central and Latin America, which are very much offering criminal protection, but it is protection against a state which is often corrupt and not effective. We have seen it during COVID, in which these gangs actually mobilized to protect some of the communities. And there is work done by several political scientists at the University of Chicago, in particular, Ben Lessing, who has done a survey of how many people live under criminal protection in Latin America. And I think it's 7 or 8% of the population, which is huge. So you have entire parts of Latin America that seem to be governed not by the institutions of authority, the legitimate institutions, but by criminal groups. You also had in the 1990s the terrible policy of the United States to send gang members back to their country of origin, often a country they never lived in. And so we have a lot of gangs from California who are now really well entrenched in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, for instance. And then, of course, this kind of criminal protection, which is a topic I continue to work on, we also see it in the north of the world, or in advanced societies. I have just published a paper with a co-author, Dr. Fanji at Oxford University, on the city of Nottingham, and we have done a huge amount of empirical work on a particular neighborhood in which we identify the presence of a criminal gang that was actually providing a sort of criminal governance that we associate with the southern Italy type, or Latin America, or maybe Russia. And that is smack in the middle of England. And we also have a recent paper on London, and we map the entire city of London, the entire city, with data on each gang for the entire city of London. And we identify some gangs that are actually in the same type, in the same mode. Namely, they're not just gangs that steal and rob or even just push drugs. They're actually gangs that join the community and are part of the community and offer community support. And obviously, it's not that I condone it, but you can see, especially in some of these communities that are immigrant communities, they cannot trust the state. There is a ability to get entrenched. But the community that we studied in Nottingham was actually not an immigrant community; it was a British community. So I think a topic that I'm keen to continue to work on is the extent to which what we associate as a problem of southern Italy, Palermo, Sicily, is actually more widespread, and it's present beyond the southern Italy, it's present beyond the traditional mafia territory, is present beyond Latin America, and can be found in countries such as France or England.
You've been working in this sector now for a long time. You've written some absolutely key books, widely quoted, Do Mafias Move, or How Do Mafias Move, for example. What do you make of the burgeoning of literature, both scholarly literature, more popular literature around organized crime, which is truly a global phenomenon? Of course, you know the work of the Global Initiative itself. What do you make of this expansion? What's working in this debate? What's not working? Where do we need to do better, in your view?
Yes, no, I know the work of the Global Initiative, and I think I'm a fellow of the Global Initiatives, which I'm very
You are indeed.
happy to be. So that's great work of documenting the trends and the phenomenon. So I think that's fantastic. And so we have a lot of very good initiatives, such as this one, but also in Latin America, in Colombia. There is another one that works mainly on organized crime in Latin America. And this journalistic, if I may say, or on the ground documentation is absolutely crucial. It's also very useful for us, of course, as academics. So we are very grateful that this happens. Now, I suppose my main problem with the literature, also including academic literature, is the confusion over what is organized crime, and there is a tendency so I don't want to sound academic, because discussions of definitions are always boring.
But go for it, Federico. It's an important point. I think Explain what makes you uncomfortable, I think, when you see this wide expansion of coverage.
Yes, so in fact, I wrote about that as well. I did a paper on the definitions and how they become more and more vague. And so for me, the catch-all sentence organized crime is a bit bankrupt in many of the way it is being used. And so I think we should really try to distinguish three key activities that go on in the illegal world, or in the legal world illegally managed. And I think one key activity is the one I've been working most of my career, as you mentioned, namely governance or protection. So the work that goes back to the work of Diego Gambetta and others, Thomas Schelling, and other great scholars like Frederick Lane. So all of us have been working on criminal governance. And so what is criminal governance? Is the idea that a criminal group tries to control the neighborhood, control the activities of society in that particular neighborhood, or a particular market. So maybe they control prostitution, maybe they control drugs, but they're not pushing drugs. They are not involved in the crime. They want to become those who decide who can commit the crime. They want to become those who decide who can open a shop. They want to decide who can be a taxi driver. So that is really a governance aspiration, which is it's got a lot in common with the state, because the state is doing exactly the same. The state is in the same business. So if I were to write a textbook in sociology, I will put the mafia in the chapter on the state, not in the chapter on crime and deviance. Now, that kind of definition and phenomenon, of course, is only one aspect of what we see, hence the confusion, because we also see at least two additional phenomena. One is the production of goods and services illegally. So illegal productions of goods and services. So we have farmers in Colombia that farm the land. We have sex workers who engage in that. So that is not governing anything. Is waking up in the morning at 5 o'clock, going to the field and work until evening, very little pay, but you happen to work in a coca farm, so you are technically defined as being a member of organized crime. But the profile and the activities and the skills that you need to engage in small-scale cultivation of marijuana or working in a field in Colombia are very different, and you are a really different beast, a different person from the mafioso who is able to use violence in the neighborhood. So for me, if you want to really understand what goes on, you have to separate these two activities and not confuse them. Also, I think it would have an impact on policy, incidentally, because the policy to reduce production is very different from the policy to reduce criminal governance, and we can come to talk about policies in a second. The third dimension that I think is also distinct, and it captures different skills and different kind of people, is trade. So what goes normally under the label of drugs trafficking, human smuggling, certain kind of cybercrime online, it's really taking the product that has been produced in the fields in Colombia, for instance, and moving it to Europe. Now, in order to do that particular job, again, you need skills, you need international connections, you need, usually, you're basically a business person who can speak several languages and who can interact with all kinds of people back in Colombia, but also in the port of Antwerp or in Italy. So for me, these three activities, production, trade, and governance, are the building blocks of what goes on in the stuff that we study. And we need to, at least analytically, distinguish them. And then also, of course, ask ourselves, is it possible to do more than one activity? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But until we make that distinction, we miss out, hence we enter into this world of confusion, which has been noted by many scholars in the field, not just by me.
This idea that scholarly work has an impact on policy, do you think scholarly work has been, or do you think scholars have been practiced enough at being able to take their work on organized crime and affect policy responses to organized crime, the growth of the criminal economy in Europe, for example, which we have tracked through the index and other things? Do you think there's scholarly work in Europe has shaped European policy, for example? I know there are many other global examples, or do we need to do much better?
Yes, I mean, I think creating indices, for instance, is very helpful and very useful. And I think it provides a service to the community of scholars and journalists and policymakers. So, in fact, in my own research project, we have created an index of cybercrime, which is a World Cybercrime Index, which is trying to copy some of the indices that we have for organized crime and also corruption. So I think creating indices is a good thing. Now, have scholars engage enough with policymakers? It's also the other way around. Have policymakers engage enough with scholars? Have they paid enough attention? And unfortunately, organized crime is a very politicized, it's a very hot topic that generates knee-jerk reaction often in the political debate. And so there has been limited, I think, dialogue between the two, and it's not only the fault of the scholars. I think it's also because I try to engage with policymaker a lot, and in some sense I was also successful to some extent, and I cannot complain. I've been invited to speak to select committees, and my work has been cited by sort of sentences of the Supreme Court and here. So there is some attention, at least for my work and also others, of course, is that there is not enough dialogue really between the two camps, and there is also the issue that what drives policymakers may not be the search for the truth, and maybe I'm thinking about policymakers within state structures. It may be a search for a quick fix and a politically charged headline that criminalizes but doesn't really go down to try to solve the problem. Unfortunately, solving the problem is not easy, and it requires resources. While it's easier to add a new specification to the criminal code, or to label something as something else, like what is organized crime labeled as terrorism. But that's not really going to do the job. I think there is great work done by academics, and I really hope there will be in the future a greater dialogue. In some way, there was in Italy to some extent in the creation of some of the ideas. I think the witness protection program is a very useful tool. I think some of the provisions in the Italian criminal code are very useful, but that's really not enough.
Okay, you talk, and we're drawing to a close now, but it's a really interesting discussion. You talk about the relationship between academics, civil society, and the state in Italy. Why was that different in your view than, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon world or elsewhere? Was this just the pressure to deliver? In some ways, we ourselves have seen that there's an openness to listen, to debate, to dialogue. That is, or at least that level of openness isn't present elsewhere.
Well, the case of Italy is dramatic, of course, because I lived through, my generation lived through the murders of very prominent local politicians, prominent judges from Palermo, up to the murder of Falcone and Borsellino. But of course, this also happened in the case of Pio La Torre, who was a local politician, Sicilian politicians. And usually what happens in Italy, after these prominent murders, you have a change in the legislation. And so legislations, for instance, to go after the money of the mafia was very important, I thought. So that was very important. And also the legislation on defining what the mafia is within the criminal code system, which really is very sophisticated thinking. That was the work of Judge Falcone. So I think that was great. And so there was paradoxically a responsiveness on the part of the judiciary and on the part of the political system in making changes to the instruments that are useful to fight organized crime. But there is a big but, namely, the mafia is still there. The Sicilian mafia is not gone away. The 'Ndrangheta, as you know, and as you report often, is very powerful. It's probably one of the most powerful mafias around the world. Is at the center of international drugs trafficking. The Camorra is still there. And not only that, but we had also the expansion of the mafias to the north of Italy, which is a phenomenon that has become very prominent since the 1970s, which is, as you mentioned, a topic of my book, Mafias on the Move. And so, while there have been reactions and responses at the level of legislation to do with the criminal code, what we still miss is an effective transformation of the civil code that makes civil disputes more easily settled and more quickly settled by courts in Italy, because it takes 12 years, 13 years on average to settle a civil court. So the temptation to use the mafia is very strong. And also, as I said before, the mafia is not just a criminal problem that you can solve simply through the criminal code. It's a social and political problem, an economic problem. And so that's what is missing, even in the case of Italy.
Federico, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation where we've touched on your career, the story of Russian organized crime, and then we've ended up talking about policy, the bigger issues in the scholarly debate around organized crime, and then of course about your home country, Italy, the engagement around policy. Thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed it very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was my pleasure, a real pleasure.